Tonight, we begin with a development that Western intelligence officials had feared, Moscow had dismissed, and Kyiv had meticulously prepared for. A naval catastrophe that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in a matter of hours. Hours that saw Russia's legendary Black Sea Fleet crippled beyond recognition. Hours that witnessed the pride of the Russian Navy burning on the waters it once dominated. Hours that changed the entire strategic calculus of this war. What Ukraine did this week crossed a line that Vladimir Putin had believed was untouchable. And when that line broke, Moscow did not have an answer. They scrambled with confusion, denial, and humiliation. Ukraine responded with precision, coordination, and devastating effectiveness. And tonight, as satellite imagery confirms the scale of the destruction, Kyiv is not just celebrating. They are mocking. They are openly, publicly, and strategically mocking Russia's so-called mighty naval power. Because what happened in the Black Sea wasn't just a military setback for Russia. It was an embarrassment. It was a humiliation. And it was broadcast for the entire world to see. Idinavd signed Prussians for months now. There had been signals not from official Kremlin sources, not from formal Russian military statements, just signals that Ukraine was preparing something unprecedented against Russia's naval assets. Ukraine has been innovative, yes, but they have been methodical in their innovation. Their moves have followed a certain pattern. A rhythm, almost a doctrine of asymmetric warfare that has confounded Russian military planners. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow this month was that the pattern went silent. Western intelligence analysts who monitor Ukrainian drone production know the indicators, the surge in component acquisitions from allied nations, the unusual activity at coastal staging areas, the increased communication between Ukrainian Naval Command and Special Operations units. The sudden redeployment of reconnaissance assets toward Crimean waters. All of that went quiet. And whenever Ukraine goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Very loud. You see, Ukraine learned early in this war that they could not match Russia ship for ship. They didn't have the fleet. They didn't have the resources. What they had was ingenuity. What they had was desperation turned into determination. What they had was a willingness to rewrite the rules of naval warfare entirely. And so, in secret facilities scattered across the country, Ukrainian engineers began building something Russia never anticipated. Unmanned surface vessels, sea drones, weapons that cost a fraction of a Russian warship but could sink one just the same. Western officials who visited these facilities described them as remarkably sophisticated operations that combined commercial technology with military precision in ways that defense contractors had only theorized about. And while Russia was busy fortifying land positions, Ukraine was quietly revolutionizing how a nation without a navy could still dominate the sea. Early Tuesday morning, British intelligence detected what they described as unprecedented naval activity in the Black Sea, including movement of Russian vessels that had not been repositioned in over 6 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only moves when they are signaling something very specific: preparation for offensive operations, fear of imminent attack, or internal reorganization due to command failures. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its naval posture. And when a nuclear power shifts naval posture without explanation, even by a small measure, NATO pays attention. What followed in the next 72 hours would validate every concern Western analysts had harbored. Ukrainian forces launched what military experts are now calling the most successful asymmetric naval campaign in modern history. Using a combination of long-range Neptune anti-ship missiles, explosive-laden unmanned surface vessels, and aerial drones operating in coordinated swarms, Ukraine systematically targeted the heart of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. The first reports came from Sevastopol. Explosions, multiple explosions. Residents in the occupied Crimean port city reported seeing fireballs rising from the naval base, a base that Russia had fortified, protected, and declared impenetrable. Within hours, satellite imagery confirmed what Ukrainian officials were already celebrating. Multiple Russian warships had been hit. At least 2 were confirmed sinking. Others were burning, listing, or fleeing toward safer waters. The Black Sea Fleet, the pride of Russian naval power, the the symbol of Moscow's dominance over these strategic waters, was in chaos, and Ukraine was just getting started. The statement issued by Ukraine's military command tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was triumphant. Official after official, briefing after briefing, described Russia's naval losses as catastrophic, irreversible. And perhaps most importantly, proof that Russia's military reputation is built on a foundation of lies. Ukrainian Defense Ministry spokesperson described the attacks as a message written in fire and steel. He said Russia had believed their fleet was untouchable. He said Russia had believed Ukraine would never dare strike at the heart of their naval power. He said Russia was wrong. But beyond the official statements, something else emerged: mockery. Open, deliberate, strategic mockery. Ukrainian social media channels, many of them operated or endorsed by government officials, began posting memes, videos, and commentary ridiculing Russia's naval losses. One viral post showed a Russian warship with the caption, "The Black Sea Fleet's new flagship, a submarine. Involuntary conversion." Another showed satellite imagery of burning vessels with the words, "Russia's special naval operation is going according to plan." This wasn't just celebration, this was psychological warfare. Ukraine understands that in the information age, humiliation can be as powerful as any weapon, and tonight they are wielding that weapon with precision. Because Russia's response today was among the most confused, contradictory, and embarrassing we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of the attacks, Russian state media attempted 3 different narratives. First, they claimed the attacks never happened, that reports were Western propaganda. Then, when satellite imagery emerged, they claimed the attacks happened but caused minimal damage. Finally, when the scale of destruction became undeniable, they claimed the attacks were a desperate Ukrainian gamble that would be met with devastating retaliation. 3 narratives, 3 contradictions, 0 credibility. Tonight, Pentagon sources confirmed that Ukraine launched coordinated strikes on multiple high-value Russian naval targets, including a Kilo-class submarine that had recently been repositioned for what analysts believe was preparation for cruise missile launches against Ukrainian cities. Ukraine struck before Russia could fire. They hit the submarine. They hit a Ropucha-class landing ship that military analysts believe was preparing for potential amphibious operations. They hit patrol vessels, support ships, and port infrastructure that were critical to Black Sea Fleet operations. In other words, Ukraine targeted not just individual vessels. They targeted Russia's entire operational capability in the region. The command structure that coordinated naval operations, the logistics network that supplied and maintained the fleet. The offensive platforms that threatened Ukrainian coastal cities. This is what made the attack so devastating. Russia's losses weren't just measured in ships sunk. They were measured in capabilities destroyed. It represented the kind of blow that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Black Sea if left unanswered. And Russia, despite all their threats and bluster, has not answered. Not effectively, not strategically. They've launched retaliatory missile strikes against Ukrainian cities, the same terroristic attacks they've been conducting for months. But they have not addressed the fundamental problem. Their fleet is now vulnerable in ways it has never been before. Ukraine didn't strike recklessly. They didn't strike impulsively. They struck strategically. They didn't waste resources on low-value targets. They didn't spread their attacks too thin. They hit command vessels. They hit offensive platforms. They hit the ships that mattered most. And in doing so, they sent a message that Russia cannot ignore. The Black Sea is no longer Russia's lake. It is a contested battle space. And Ukraine is winning. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Russia's recent naval movements were designed to test the resolve of Ukrainian forces after months of attritional ground warfare. Russia wanted to see whether Ukraine would deplete resources defending against naval threats. Russia wanted to see whether Western support was weakening. Russia wanted to see whether Ukraine's innovative spirit had exhausted itself. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't show weakness. They demonstrated a level of capability that was so precise, so coordinated, that even Russian military bloggers, typically the most loyal propagandists, expressed shock and concern. You don't get Russia's attention easily. Their state media is designed to dismiss, deflect, and deny. But today, Ukraine broke through that wall. Russian military bloggers, many of them with direct connections to the armed forces, described the attacks as a serious blow and questioned why naval defenses had failed so completely. One prominent blogger wrote, "We were told the fleet was protected. We were told Ukraine could not touch us. We were lied to." That kind of internal criticism is rare, and it signals that Russia's information control is cracking. Defense analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's naval posture as fundamentally compromised, a way to acknowledge that the Black Sea Fleet can no longer operate with impunity. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and creative. Their attacks were not only effective, they were timed so precisely that Russian air defenses had no opportunity to respond. Multiple strikes, multiple vectors, multiple targets, all within a window so narrow that Russian command structure was overwhelmed. That coordination matters because it shows Western training is working. It shows that Ukrainian forces are not just surviving, they are evolving, they are adapting, they are becoming more dangerous to Russian forces with each passing month. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's naval campaign. Ukrainian sea drones carried out strikes on vessels anchored in Sevastopol harbor, forcing Russia to consider relocating remaining fleet assets to Novorossiysk, essentially abandoning their primary Crimean naval base. Ukrainian forces targeted a Russian intelligence-gathering ship that had been monitoring NATO movements in the last several months. Special operations units operating along the Crimean coast reportedly destroyed radar installations used by Russia to coordinate naval air defense. This wasn't just an attack. This wasn't just a raid. This was a systematic degradation of Russian naval power. This was a campaign designed to achieve strategic effect, and strategic effect is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since they abandoned their assault on Kyiv in the first months of the war. For every advance Russia has made on land, and those advances have been costly, grinding, and limited, Ukraine has countered with something that undermines Russian confidence, capability, or credibility. The sinking of the Moskva in April 2022 was the first major blow. The liberation of Snake Island was another. The Kerch Bridge attacks humiliated Russian security services. And now, this week's systematic destruction of Black Sea Fleet assets represents perhaps the most comprehensive naval defeat Russia has suffered since World War II. Let that sink in. A nation without a functional navy has effectively neutralized one of the world's largest naval powers in its own territorial waters. That's not just military success, that's a revolution in warfare. Remember, Russia thought Ukraine would fall in 3 days. They thought Zelensky would flee. They thought the Ukrainian military would collapse. They thought NATO would fracture. They thought the world would move on. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is stronger than ever. Zelensky has become a global symbol of resistance. The Ukrainian military has evolved into one of the most battle-hardened forces in the world. NATO has expanded, adding Finland and Sweden, two nations that had maintained neutrality for decades. And the world has not moved on. The world is watching. The world is supporting. The world is providing Ukraine with the weapons, intelligence, and training needed to defend their homeland. Russia's strategic assumptions have collapsed one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion. They assumed economic sanctions would fade. They haven't. They assumed Western unity would crumble. It hasn't. They assumed Ukraine would negotiate from weakness. Ukraine has refused. And now, Russia's assumption that their Black Sea Fleet was untouchable has been shattered literally in the waters off Crimea. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Russia's naval humiliation happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under unprecedented domestic pressure. Russian military hardliners want more aggressive action. They want total mobilization, tactical nuclear threats, and escalation against NATO. Russian oligarchs want the war to end. Their assets are frozen, their lifestyles disrupted, and their futures uncertain. Russian military commanders want resources. They are fighting a war with inadequate supplies, demoralized troops, and strategic confusion. Russian intelligence services want someone to blame. The failures have been too numerous, too public, and too embarrassing. And the Russian public, while still subject to state propaganda, is beginning to ask questions that the Kremlin cannot easily answer. Putin is balancing these demands while trying to project strength on the world stage. And when leaders in that position suffer visible, undeniable defeats, they don't respond rationally. They respond from pressure. They respond from vulnerability. They respond from desperation. That's what makes the coming days and weeks so critical. Russia may escalate, not because escalation serves their strategic interests, but because Putin cannot afford to appear weak. And when nuclear powers make decisions based on ego rather than strategy, the entire world pays attention. NATO's official statement, now circulating through diplomatic channels worldwide, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow Russian aggression to succeed. Alliance officials said plainly that Russia's continued attacks on Ukrainian civilians were inconsistent with the conduct expected of any civilized nation. That is diplomatic language for Russia is behaving like a rogue state, and the world has noticed. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, the Pentagon confirmed that the United States is accelerating delivery of additional military aid to Ukraine. This includes more advanced air defense systems. This includes more long-range strike capabilities. This includes more of the precise weapons that made this week's naval success possible. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin stated that Ukraine has demonstrated remarkable capability and determination, language that signals Washington's confidence in Ukrainian military leadership. And in Brussels, EU officials announced new sanctions targeting Russian shipping and naval supply chains, measures designed to make it even harder for Russia to rebuild what Ukraine has destroyed. The international community is not backing down. They are doubling down. Meanwhile, President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a powerful, defiant speech tonight. He said Russia believed their ships were invincible. Today, they learned that nothing is invincible when it faces the will of free people. He said, every vessel we sink brings us closer to victory. Every defeat we inflict reminds the world that Ukraine will not surrender. And he said, to Moscow, I say this, your fleet burns, your soldiers fall, your empire crumbles, and still you do not understand. You cannot win this war. You never could. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands that words matter as much as weapons. Zelensky has mastered the art of communication. He speaks to his people with resolve. He speaks to Russia with contempt. He speaks to the world with moral clarity. And tonight, with Russian warships burning as his backdrop, his words carry more weight than ever. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's naval losses weren't isolated. Along with the Black Sea Fleet devastation, Russian forces launched another wave of cruise missiles against Ukrainian cities, killing civilians and destroying infrastructure. Russian officials made new threats about nuclear escalation threats that Western analysts are monitoring closely. Russian media increased propaganda targeting Western audiences, attempting to erode support for Ukraine. All of this happened within the same week. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. They are attempting to change the narrative. They are attempting to shift attention away from their military failures. They are attempting to frighten the West into reducing support for Ukraine. But so far, it isn't working. Western leaders have remained united. Public support for Ukraine remains strong. And Ukraine's military continues to demonstrate that Russian power is far more fragile than anyone, including Russia, believed. Military analysts are now considering several possibilities for Russia's next moves. One is that Russia is preparing to withdraw remaining Black Sea Fleet assets to save reports essentially conceding naval dominance to Ukraine. Another is that Russia is attempting to surge additional air defense systems to protect remaining vessels, a defensive posture that would limit their offensive capabilities. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is considering asymmetric escalation, including potential attacks on Western supply lines or even direct threats against NATO members. But today, Ukraine took the escalation card off the table. They didn't wait for Russia to rebuild. They didn't wait for Russia to adapt. They didn't wait for diplomatic negotiations that never produce results. They struck. And in striking, they demonstrated that waiting is not their strategy. Proactive, precision, devastating action is their strategy. And so far, that strategy is working. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine can sustain this level of operational tempo. Ukraine wants to show the world that they can. NATO wants to prevent any escalation that draws the alliance into direct conflict. And China, watching from the sidelines, wants to understand what these events mean for their own ambitions in Taiwan. Every power is calculating, every power is adjusting, every power understands that what happens in the Black Sea matters far beyond these waters. Because if a nation like Ukraine can defeat a nation like Russia using innovation, determination, and Western support, what does that mean for other conflicts? What does that mean for other aggressors who believe military might guarantee success? What does that mean for the future of warfare itself? These questions don't have easy answers. But tonight, one thing is clear. The old rules are changing, and Ukraine is writing the new ones. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian naval movements across the entire Black Sea region. They say Russia is pulling remaining high-value vessels away from Crimean waters. They say Russian naval commanders are requesting reinforcements that simply don't exist. And they say Russia's decision to position the Black Sea Fleet so close to Ukrainian strike range was a strategic miscalculation that is now impossible to reverse. But Ukraine is not resting. In fact, Ukrainian officials announced tonight that additional operations are being planned. They provided no details. They offered no timeline. They simply said Russia should not sleep well. Their response today, precise, coordinated, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that the cost of this war will only increase. And it sent a message to the West that their investment in Ukrainian defense is paying dividends. Every dollar spent on Ukrainian military capability is a dollar that degrades Russian power. Every weapon system delivered is a system that protects Ukrainian lives. Every training program completed produces soldiers who can defeat Russian forces. This is not charity. This is strategy. And tonight, that strategy is succeeding. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with their recent naval posturing. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It prevented potential Russian offensive operations. It destroyed capabilities that threatened Ukrainian cities. And it demonstrated to the world that Ukraine remains capable, creative, and determined. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the coming weeks. If they choose to escalation, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of the end for Russian naval dominance in the Black Sea. If they choose escalation, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown they will not be intimidated. Russia built their Black Sea fleet over decades. Ukraine has degraded it in months. That asymmetry, the difference between what Russia thought they had and what they actually have, is the story of this entire war. And tonight, for the first time in generations, Russia appears to be afraid. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times, but refuses to accept. Russia is not invincible. Ukraine is not weak. And the world is not willing to let aggression succeed. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine is winning the naval war. Russia's humiliation is complete, and the Black Sea Fleet will never be the same. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.